Welcome to a journey through the hidden corridors of history, where pages once thought closed will quietly open again, revealing secrets that time itself tried to hide. This is The Hidden Female Samurai of Japan, a story both real and shrouded in myth, where the breath of epic battles mingles with the whispers of forgotten women. It's a tale that will keep you listening until your eyes begin to close, still wondering what truth might lie beyond the next shadow. Across 5 chapters, we'll travel together through the mists of centuries to meet the Onna-Bugeisha, the female warriors of ancient Japan, women who once stood shoulder to shoulder with male samurai who led troops into battle and whose courage was written not in ink, but in blood and silence. You'll hear of great wars and secret loyalties, of conspiracies wrapped in silk, and of legends that refused to die even when the world forgot their names. Each chapter will open a new doorway, sometimes into truth, sometimes into the echoes of a dream the past still remembers. So prepare yourself, not just for a journey through time, but for a descent into the very soul of ancient Japan, a place where honor, loyalty, and tragedy dance together in the flicker of a blade. And if you're ready to step with me into this realm of shadows and steel, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Because only by staying until the end will you see the truths that history itself tried to bury. Now, take a deep breath, let your body relax, and allow this story to carry you into sleep, where past and present meet, and the soft ring of a forgotten sword guides you through the dreams of warriors long gone, but never truly lost. The story always begins the same way: a field shrouded in morning mist, a lone figure standing against the wind, and the sound, soft, deliberate of a sword leaving its sheath. For centuries, this was the image of Japan that the world held close. The noble samurai, bound by honor, sharp as the blade he carried. A man of loyalty, discipline, and quiet fire. A man whose shadow stretched across history. But every shadow hides something, and in the glow of his legend there stood others, unseen, unspoken, waiting. Because while men wrote the chronicles of power, women were writing something else entirely: survival. In the scrolls and paintings of the old world, the samurai stands alone, his armor polished, his sword catching the light, his story immortalized. Beside him, sometimes, a woman appears, graceful, composed, her gaze lowered. A wife, a concubine, a ghost of presence. Yet what those brushstrokes do not show is the steel beneath her silk. They do not show the calluses on her hands from training at dawn, or the way she stood watch while the men slept. A naginata, a long, curved blade weapon resting quietly at her side. The naginata was elegant, almost poetic. It could sweep an enemy from his horse or hold a line against a dozen foes. But for the women of samurai households, it was also a symbol, a way of saying, "We can protect what you leave behind." The chronicles rarely mention their names. When wars broke out, as they always did, the men marched away, their banners rising like a forest of flame. Behind them, the women remained. They guarded fortresses, villages, children. They held the line, not because they were permitted to, but because there was no one else left to do it. In the quiet hours before dawn, they trained. Not for recognition, not for reward, but because survival has always been a woman's inheritance. History called them Onna-Bugeisha, literally women of the warrior class. They fought, commanded troops, and sometimes died with the same dignity as their brothers and husbands. And yet, in most tales, they were erased, turned into footnotes beneath the glory of men. Why? Because stories, like kingdoms, are often ruled by those who hold the pen. If you open the great epics of Japan, Heike Monogatari, Taiheki, you'll find their traces only in whispers. A fleeting mention here, a passing description there. But beneath those fragments lies an entire hidden world. It is the world where Tomoe Gozen rides into battle beside Minamoto no Yoshinaka, where Hojo Masako commands armies from within temple walls, where Nakano Takeko defends her dying era with the grace of a falling petal. Each of them, a flame that refused to go out, even as the wind of history tried to erase their light. The samurai ethos, Bushido, the way of the warrior, was said to belong to men. It demanded courage, honor, loyalty, and self-sacrifice. But these women lived that code just as fiercely, perhaps more so. For them, honor was not a choice. It was survival wrapped in silence. Imagine the world they lived in, a world where a woman's worth was measured by her obedience. And yet, when the moment came, she was expected to pick up a weapon and defend the house. Imagine the weight of that paradox. To be invisible, yet indispensable. To be forgotten, yet unforgettable. That was the shadow beneath the samurai's glory. The unseen shape of the Onna-Bugeisha. Centuries later, as the image of the samurai became legend in theater, in art, in the dreams of a modern nation, the women faded even further into myth. Kabuki actors played the loyal wife, the tragic lover, the avenger in disguise. Woodblock prints showed women clutching swords under the moonlight, but always through the gaze of men, beautiful, tragic, doomed. What the art did not say was that these were not inventions. They were memories, echoes of real women whose blood once marked the same earth where cherry blossoms fall each spring. Perhaps that's why their stories feel so haunting now, because they were never told loudly enough to fade. They lived in silence, and silence endures. When a samurai died with honor, his name was recorded. When a woman fought and survived, her story was often buried with her. But in the corners of the temples, in the diaries of priests, in the whispered songs of rural mothers, their legends persisted. A lullaby might mention the lady who fought the bandits. A folk tale might speak of a ghost with a blade of moonlight. And slowly, those fragments stitched themselves into something whole. A secret lineage, a hidden history. By the time scholars began to ask questions, centuries too late, the line between history and myth had blurred beyond repair. But does that matter? Because perhaps the truth of these women lies not in the accuracy of records, but in the power of their memory. They are not relics, they are archetypes. Every generation of Japanese women, from the farmers of Aizu to the students of modern Tokyo, has carried a trace of that same resilience. And when a woman stands her ground, calm and unwavering, somewhere unseen, an ancient spirit nods in recognition. So this is where our story begins. Not on the battlefield, but in the quiet places history forgot. In the soft thud of wooden practice swords striking before dawn. in the rustle of armor that no one was supposed to wear, in the still eyes of a woman who knows that duty is heavier than fear. She does not speak. She does not boast. She simply waits for the moment when the world will need her again. Because history, like the tide, always returns. And when it does, the Onna-Bugeisha will rise once more, not from legend, but from the memory that never died. The sound of a single drum echoes in the distance. Slow, steady, patient, like a heartbeat beneath layers of mist. In the valleys of ancient Japan, war had become the rhythm of life. And from that rhythm, something unexpected began to stir. It began in silence. When men marched off to battle, their armor gleaming under a cold dawn, they left behind not emptiness, but waiting. The kind of waiting that sharpens itself into purpose. Behind paper doors, in the flicker of lamplight, women trained, their shadows mowed like brushstrokes across the floor. Deliberate, fluid, precise. The sound of a blade slicing air was their prayer, the discipline of breath, their meditation. And though the world did not yet have a name for them, they were already becoming the Onna-Bugeisha, women of the warrior path. The first lessons were quiet ones. A mother teaching her daughter to hold the naginata, a long, curved blade at the end of a staff. Its motion was a dance of distance and grace. Its strength lay not in power, but in flow. The blade was meant to extend the body, not defy it. And in that movement, these women discovered something sacred, a balance between gentleness and force. At night, the forests hummed with cicadas, and in the soft chorus of nature, the sound of wooden staffs striking echoed faintly. Tuck, tuck, tuck. Training not for vengeance, but for survival. The naginata would later become known as the woman's weapon. But in those early centuries, it was something much deeper, a bridge between necessity and dignity. They trained not because they sought glory, they trained because no one else would stand between their homes and the fire that approached from the hills. The wind shifts. Centuries pass. The 12th century, the Genpei War. The sky burns red with banners of two mighty clans, the Taira and the Minamoto. And among the thundering hooves and clashing blades, one name emerges from the smoke. Tomoe Gozen. They say her beauty was striking, but it was her calm that unsettled men the most. She rode with the Minamoto army, her armor gleaming like silver moonlight. Her hair, bound high, swayed behind her as she charged into battle. In the chronicles, they wrote, Tomoe was a warrior worth 1,000 men, beautiful, fearless, and unmatched in combat. Yet the ink of history rarely captures breath. What those words cannot show is the way the air trembled before she struck. The silence, the inhale, the precise control. The discipline of a warrior who fought not for legend, but for duty. On the final day of her Lord Yoshinaka's defeat, Tomoe did not flee. The battlefield was chaos, mud, blood, banners torn apart. But she rode forward, alone, toward an enemy general whose name history barely remembers. One swift movement, a clash of steel, a cry swallowed by wind, and it was over. Then she vanished. Some say she became a nun. Some say she walked into the mountains and never looked back. But perhaps she became part of the wind itself, that same wind that moves the cherry blossoms each spring, carrying both beauty and sorrow in its wake. The story shifts, as stories always do, from the clang of metal to the hush of politics, from battlefields to temples, from Tomoe Gozen to Hojo Masako. If Tomoe was the sword, Masako was the mind behind it. Her battlefield was not made of earth and blood, but of words, power, and patience. When her husband, the great shogun Minamoto no Yoritomo, died, the world expected her to fade quietly into widowhood. And she did, for a moment. She shaved her head, took Buddhist vows, and withdrew behind temple walls. But beyond those quiet gates, she built an empire. Through whispers and ink, Masako guided Japan. She ruled not from a throne, but from the shadows of a shrine. They called her the Nun Shogun, both an insult and a prophecy. When rebellion came, she stood before the generals and said, "If you cannot fight for your honor, then I will fight for it in your place." The hall fell silent. Even the banners seemed to bow. Masako never carried a sword, yet she cut through the arrogance of men sharper than any blade could. Her legacy was made not from victories, but from endurance, from the art of waiting for the right moment to act. The centuries turned again. Japan shifted like a living creature, from the Heian grace to the iron discipline of the Edo era. And still, the Onna-Bugeisha lived on, some in training halls, some in stories whispered to daughters before sleep, until, one last time, their spirits took form in the figure of Nakano Takeko, the warrior of Aizu. Imagine it. The year is 1868. The age of samurai is ending. Gunfire replaces swords. The old codes crumble beneath the weight of modernization. Yet in a small northern domain, under grey skies heavy with smoke, a young woman ties a white headband around her forehead, the color of death before dishonor. Her name is Nakano Takeko. She gathers her sisters, her students, her friends. They form the Joshitai, the women's army of Aizu. No one ordered them to fight. They simply chose to. Their armor was light. Their weapons, the naginata of their ancestors. But what they lacked in power, they carried in conviction. The sound of rifles cracks through the mist. Nakano's command is calm, almost serene. Forward. The women advance, their white bands fluttering like ghosts reborn. The enemy fires again. Smoke thickens. Nakano falls, struck in the chest. Yet she does not collapse. She kneels, breath trembling, and whispers to her sister beside her, "Take my head before they do." It is not cruelty. It is control. The final act of a warrior who refuses to let fate decide her end. Her sister obeys, tears mixing with blood and rain. The head of Nakano Takeko is carried to a nearby temple, buried with honor. And there, even now, cherry trees bloom in spring. When the wind passes through them, their petals fall softly, like the quiet march of ghosts who never lost their way. The echoes of these women, Tomoe, Masako, Nakano, linger in every stone, every story, every practice hall, where the naginata still spins through the air. They are not remembered as symbols of rebellion, but as reminders of balance. Because the way of the Onna-Bugeisha was never about defying men. It was about restoring harmony between strength and compassion, courage and restraint, silence and power. Their stories are not loud. They move like water, gentle, inevitable. The kind of stories that shape mountains over time. Now, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the moon above a battlefield long gone, its light glinting off forgotten armor. Somewhere, a single naginata lies in the grass, dew settling on its blade. The night is still. The earth remembers, and if you listen carefully, beneath the hum of the wind, you might still hear them. The women who fought not for glory, but for peace. Their voices soft, yet unyielding. We are here. We have always been here. There is a saying in Japan, the cherry blossom falls at the height of its beauty. Perhaps that is why the stories of the women who bore swords, who lived fiercely and vanished quietly, still shimmer like petals in a storm. The world remembers a few names, whispered through centuries of silence. Each one a different kind of strength. Each one a reflection of what it meant to fight in a world that seldom looked their way. The first is Tomoe Gozen. Her legend glows like an ember that refuses to fade. To speak her name is to feel the scent of iron and rain. She rode with the Minamoto clan during the Genpei War, a time when the land trembled beneath the hooves of rival armies. Her armor, white and gold, gleamed like a promise under the storm clouds. She fought with a calm that made men hesitate. There was no fury, no cry, only precision. The kind of control that turns battle into art. Chronicles describe her as a warrior worth 1,000 men. But they never tell you how the 1,000 men must have feared her silence more than her sword. When Tomoe rode, the wind itself seemed to bow. In one account, she single-handedly beheaded an enemy general twice her size, his armor heavy as guilt. She didn't do it for glory. She did it because the line would not break, and someone had to hold it. When her lord Yoshinaka fell in battle, Tomoe did not surrender. She vanished into legend. Some say she became a nun. Others that she simply walked into the mountains, carrying her sword as one might carry memory. But even now, in some remote temples, the monks claim that on stormy nights, the sound of hooves echoes faintly in the mist, as if a single rider still keeps her watch. The story shifts again. The wind that once carried war now moves through the pine forests of Kamakura. And there, behind walls of carved wood and chanting monks, lives another kind of warrior, Hojo Masako. If Tomoe was the fire of battle, Masako was the stillness after it. The daughter of a warrior, the wife of a shogun, and then in time, the quiet ruler of Japan itself. When her husband, Minamoto no Yoritomo, died, the court expected her to fade into silence. She shaved her head, donned the robes of a nun, and retreated to a temple. But Masako was not made for withdrawal. Her silence was strategy. Her prayer beads were chains of command. Behind the temple walls, she orchestrated alliances, shaped policies, and played the intricate game of power better than any man alive. Her voice never needed to rise. When she spoke, the room adjusted around her. The samurai lords called her Ama Shogun, the nun general. It was meant to mock her. Instead, it crowned her. During one rebellion, she stood before hardened generals who doubted her authority. The hall was cold. Masako looked at them, men twice her size, half her courage, and said, If none among you will fight for honor, then I shall." Silence followed. No one laughed. The rebellion was crushed. Masako ruled not through fear, but through something rarer: inevitability. Her power was quiet, patient, and absolute, the kind of power that never announces itself. Centuries later, when historians wrote about her, they struggled to decide whether she was villain or savior. Perhaps she was both. Because true power, like the tide, does not ask permission before it changes the shore. And then there was Nakano Takeko, a name carried not by scholars, but by schoolgirls in the north, where the snow falls heavier and the spirits linger longer. The year was 1868. The world had shifted again. The age of the samurai was dying, replaced by rifles, politics, and the foreign hum of the modern world. Yet, in Aizu, a quiet stronghold of loyalty, the old ways made their final stand. Nakano was not born to lead an army, but when duty called, she did not hesitate. She gathered her students, young women trained in the art of the naginata, the same curved blade their ancestors once held. They tied white bands around their foreheads, the color of death before defeat. The battlefield was chaos. Gunfire, smoke, and the faint scent of plum blossoms drifting in from the edge of town. Nakano's commands were clear, her movements like water cutting through fire. For a moment, time folded. Ancient and modern Japan meeting in one heartbeat. When the bullet struck her chest, she did not scream. She looked toward the sky, gray, endless, and whispered to her sister, "Do not let them take me." And so, her sister did what warriors had done for centuries. With tears and trembling hands, she carried out the final act of loyalty. Nakano's head was buried near a temple, beneath the trees where the first snow always falls. To this day, pilgrims leave flowers there, not out of sorrow, but reverence, because she did not die a victim. She died completing a promise. Each of these women carried a different blade. Tomoe's was strength. Masako's was wisdom. Nakano's was sacrifice. But together, they forged something eternal, a pattern of resistance that could not be erased, no matter how deeply history tried to bury it. In paintings and scrolls, men filled the pages, their armor, their wars, their glory. Yet in the margins, if you look closely, faint brushstrokes remain. The curve of a woman's hand, the glint of a blade shaped for grace as much as death. That is where the Onna-Bugeisha live now, between ink and silence. If you walk the old battlefields today, the air feels different. Grass grows where blood once fell. The rivers whisper under bridges older than memory. And yet, if you pause, just for a breath, the world tilts slightly, as though listening. Somewhere between the sound of wind and water, their stories hum, not loud, but unyielding. It is said that cherry blossoms fall faster when it rains. Maybe that's true, but legends, the kind born of courage and grief, never really fall. They drift. They return, each spring, wearing new names, new faces, new voices. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of the Lady Warriors. They were not meant to conquer the world. They were meant to remind it that strength wears many forms, that sometimes the quietest defiance is the one that endures. Their spirits still move through the modern streets of Japan, in the laughter of schoolgirls walking home, in the discipline of martial artists at dawn, in the patience of women who choose dignity over despair. They are not ghosts. They are continuity. So if you ever find yourself in Japan during a spring, stand beneath the falling blossoms. Listen. You might feel a chill, like fingers brushing the edge of your sleeve. That's them, the Onna-Bugeisha, still watching, still waiting, still alive in every act of quiet courage the world forgets to notice. The clang of swords fades, the thunder of hooves, the cries of warriors drift into the distance, until what remains is silence. The kind of silence that feels alive, as though listening to what has just been lost. War ends, but the women who fought do not simply vanish with the smoke. They step back into the shadows of ordinary life, and yet their presence lingers like a pulse beneath the skin of Japan. Because the Onna-Bugeisha were never only soldiers. They were mothers, teachers, poets, and quiet architects of memory. And when the swords were laid to rest, they continued the battle, not with steel, but with spirit. In the centuries that followed, Japan began to change, and the chaos of feudal warfare gave way to the measured rhythm of peace. The Edo period arrived, an age of structure, refinement, and discipline. For many, the sword became more symbol than weapon. Yet the lessons of the Onna-Bugeisha endured, woven invisibly into daily life. In some towns, young girls still practiced with wooden staffs, their movements slow, graceful but precise. In temples, women prayed not just for peace, but for strength to hold their families together. And in the stories told by candlelight, the heroines no longer wielded weapons, but wisdom. The battlefield had shifted from plains of blood to the quiet struggles of existence. Even the art changed. Painters began to capture women with expressions both serene and unyielding. Calligrapher spoke of the brush as a blade, each stroke a choice, each pause a breath before the strike. It was said that those who mastered the brush understood the sword, for both demanded harmony of body and mind. The philosophy of Bushido, the way of the warrior, had always emphasized loyalty, honor, and discipline. But what few realize is that the Onna-Bugeisha shaped that ideal as much as any man. They infused it with compassion, a softer form of strength, no less powerful. Where men were taught to conquer, women were taught to endure. And endurance, in the long rhythm of history, always outlasts conquest. If you walk through old shrines today, you'll find small offerings, flowers, silk ribbons, folded paper cranes. Some of them rest before statues of male warriors, but many, perhaps more than people notice, are left before the image of a woman holding a naginata. The tourists may pass by unaware, but the locals know. They bow not just to a goddess, but to memory, to the unseen lineage of strength passed down like an heirloom. It is in these quiet gestures that the Onna-Bugeisha live on. No longer in armor, but in spirit. No longer in war, but in the rhythm of work, motherhood, resilience. The modern world often thinks of warriors as those who fight on visible fronts. But Japan remembers differently. The woman tending her garden through winter snow, the mother who stays awake through the night beside a fevered child, the teacher who passes knowledge without seeking recognition. They are the inheritors of that same spirit. The sword became a metaphor, the battlefield a mirror, and through it all, the code of the Onna-Bugeisha whispered one truth: courage is not found in battle, It is found in remaining unbroken. There's an old legend told in northern Japan of a temple bell that rings only when the moon is full. They say it was forged from the melted armor of women who no longer wished to fight. When the bell tolls, it sounds like the hum of a blade drawn slowly from its sheath, not as a threat, but as remembrance. The monks who guard the temple call it the bell of resolve. Each tone echoes across the valley, reminding all who hear it that strength need not roar. Sometimes it is enough to simply endure, to remain. In literature, too, their influence quietly endured. Writers of the Edo and Meiji eras began to craft heroines who dared expectation, not through rebellion, but through subtle defiance. A woman who protects her home while her husband is away. A widow who manages a family estate with wisdom sharper than any blade. A daughter who chooses knowledge over marriage. To the Western world, they may seem gentle tales, but in Japan, these were revolutions written in ink. Each story a mirror of the old Onna-Bugeisha, warriors reborn through words. And perhaps that is the beauty of legacy. It adapts. The Onna-Bugeisha were not frozen in time. Their strength transformed with the world, from sword to pen, from battle cry to lullaby. Their descendants may no longer train in armor, but they still carry the discipline of motion, the awareness of space, the respect for silence. In every tea ceremony, every bow, every pause before a speech, the precision of the warrior lives on. Because Bushido was never truly about violence, it was about balance. And balance is what these women embodied better than anyone else. Now, imagine standing at dusk on the grounds of an ancient dojo. The floorboards creak softly beneath your feet. Dust dances in the last slant of sunlight. You can almost hear the faint echo of wooden weapons meeting, the sharp inhale before each strike. No one is there. Yet the air is thick with presence. The ghosts of discipline and devotion linger, not hauntingly but protectively, because once a place has known such focus, it never truly forgets. The age of samurai ended long ago, but the Onna-Bugeisha were never only creatures of an age. They were reflections of something eternal, the quiet courage to stand, even when unseen. And so, their story moves beyond battlefields and borders. It becomes the heartbeat of a culture that still bows, still honors, still remembers. When cherry blossoms fall, they do not vanish. They return to the soil, to nourish new life. In the same way, the spirit of the Onna-Bugeisha sank into the earth of Japan. Invisible, yet everywhere. Every act of grace under pressure, every moment of stillness in chaos is their echo. So the next time you hear the sound of a temple bell carried by the wind, pause. Listen. It might be them. Not calling for battle, but reminding the world that strength can be quiet and silence can be victory. When legends fade, they don't die. They simply wait. Sometimes they hide in the folds of history books. Sometimes in the pause between two lines of poetry. And sometimes, if you listen closely, they whisper through stories like this one. The tale of the Onna-Bugeisha, Japan's forgotten female warriors, began in smoke and steel and ends in the quiet hum of the modern world. No armor now, no banners in the wind, only memory. And echoes that refuse to fade. Yet perhaps that's how legends prefer to live. Not as relics locked behind glass, but as feelings that awaken when the world grows still enough to remember. Think of it. Centuries ago, Tomoe Gozen rode into the storm. Now her name drifts like incense across oceans, carried by films, books, and voices, like mine. Hojo Masako, the nun who ruled in silence, still breathes in every woman who commands with calm instead of fear. And Nakano Takeko, that young warrior who met rifles with resolve, lives on in anyone who dares to face impossible odds with quiet dignity. Their world is gone, yet their reflection lingers, not in the armor they wore, but in the choices we make every day. Because somewhere deep down, the warrior's code never truly left us. It whispers in the way we endure. It hums in the calm before the storm. And in every person who refuses to yield, even silently, the Onna-Bugeisha breathe again. In modern Japan, the naginata is no longer a weapon of war. It's an art, graceful, rhythmic, meditative. The weapon that once carved through armor now cuts through silence. Each arc of its blade connects past and present, discipline and peace, memory and motion. Stand in a dojo and listen. The soft tap of bamboo, the whisper of silk sleeves, the breath drawn before the strike. It's the same sound that echoed 1,000 years ago. Just slower now, gentler. Because that's what time does to all fierce things. It softens them, but never erases them. And perhaps that's the final lesson they left behind. That strength does not always roar. Sometimes it's stillness, sometimes it's grace, sometimes it's simply waiting for the world to catch up to the truth you already know. There's another kind of battle now, not fought with swords, but with memory. In a world of noise and light and endless scrolling, the hardest thing to protect is stillness, the space where stories can breathe. So maybe the modern samurai isn't the one who fights, but the one who listens, the one who remembers. If you've come this far, if you've walked through every whisper of history with me, then perhaps you too are part of their legacy. Not because you wield a blade, but because you seek truth in a world that keeps forgetting to look. That curiosity, that quiet fascination, it's the same flame that kept their stories alive when even history had turned away. And so, as we reach the end of this journey, perhaps the question is not whether they existed. Of course they did. The real question is, how much of them still lives within us? When you stand your ground in silence, when you choose compassion over cruelty, when you hold your dignity instead of anger, that is the Bushido they left behind. It just wears different armor now. Because that's the beauty of legends. They evolve as we do. 1,000 years ago, courage meant picking up a sword. Today, it might mean putting one down. So before you drift into sleep, let your thoughts wander. Through the mountains of Heian, Japan, through the wind of Aizu, through the faint ring of steel beneath the moon. See them there, the women who stood when the world told them to kneel, the ones who carried fire in their hearts and calm in their eyes. They are not ghosts, they are memory, alive and patient. They are the breath between your thoughts, the stillness between your heartbeats. And if this story has moved you, even softly, let that be your offering. Subscribe, not just to this channel, but to the idea that stories like theirs must keep burning. Because every click, every listen, every quiet moment spent remembering is another way to whisper back to history. We haven't forgotten you. So when you see that small red button below this video, think of it as a lantern. One more flame carried through the dark. Press it gently, not because I ask you to, but because the Onna-Bugeisha would want their fire to keep glowing. Now, close your eyes. The story has ended, but its spirit lingers, in the stillness, in the rhythm of your breath. The battles are over. The warriors rest. But their courage, their quiet, unshakable light, is yours to keep. Sleep well, traveler. And when you wake, carry their strength with you. Silent, steady, unbreakable. And as the screen fades to black, the wind carries a whisper. They were never gone. They were only waiting to be remembered.